Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Logos and Keith Preston, and we're here going to talk about the issue of inflation and how it's more multifaceted than sort of like tuning into Fox News would let you believe. So, Logos, why don't you sort of explain this?
Oh, thanks. I'll try not to take too much time, but this is kind of a complex topic. In some cases, it's hard to know even where to begin. So I brought this up a little while ago on your celebration stream. It's kind of like a real world topic that you can bring up, current events and news to kind of draw in viewers or, keep people engaged with the news. And what was going on at the time, and is still going on, is you're seeing rising prices of various goods all over the country and all sorts of movements. So stocks increasing and decreasing in price of oil going up, price of lumber going up, housing is getting expensive to build, and so on. And I'm seeing a lot of, say, right-wing media right now saying, well, this is inflation, this is Joe Biden's America, this is terrible. And it got me thinking this broader discussion about inflation and how people think about rising price levels in different sectors of the economy, for good and for ill. So for the longest time, housing has been like a major problem in a lot of major cities. And some people, like say on the far left, will want to deal with it, but they'll want to say something like, well, it's the landlord system that's a problem, abolish rents, landlords just raising prices because they can. Other people want to say that, well, this is like a supply issue for housing. If we build more housing, this issue will eventually fix itself. But I don't find that people really look at like the mechanism of why housing prices are rising. In the broad political discussion, aside from the far left that seems to attribute to like landlord greed, I don't see enough discussion about, the relationship, say, between immigration, the fact that even domestically, if people move, and they have been more likely to move since the 90s, they move to big cities, along with immigrating to the cities from other countries, housing prices go up on the basis of the fact that, you can relax zoning laws and stuff, you can build more efficiently. But when your prospective entrance to a city are the entire world, there's only so much you can do. And so some people, it's like a Schrodinger's thing, where people will treat it simultaneously as like, well, it's like an act of God. The housing prices just go up because that's just what the market's doing. But then for other things, like the right will talk about like, price of lumber, price of oil, or trucking being more expensive. And this is the government's fault. This is the budget deficits. This is something the government should fix. This is something the government should do something about. But I don't really hear them talking a lot about things like housing in the same vein. Nobody's been looking at the price of housing for the last like 20 years on the right that I've seen, in at least most mainstream conservative media, and saying this is an emergency, we should do something about this. And this goes for things that especially have been outstripping the rate of normal inflation, like healthcare, housing, college education, and things in that category. This also gets me to, I guess, another central question of the topic is, when is a rise in prices inflationary? When is it not inflationary? And I don't think everybody's going to learn economics exactly the same way, but when I learned econ, one of the things I understood about inflation is like, if something is truly just nominally inflationary, what should be happening is price levels and income levels should kind of be rising in concert to some degree because there's more money in the system. Now, if you're a Keynesian, you might say there's a lag in information between like rising prices and what employers pay workers, or vice versa, depending on the context. Like there can be some lag there, but a lot of the big theory in economics, such as like rational expectations theory and other Chicago schools theories, is that eventually people will get used to the new amount of money in the economy, and all expectations will adjust accordingly. So eventually it's just like, okay, everybody has 10 times more money, everything costs 10 times more, and you kind of reach this new equilibrium. But oftentimes we talk about prices rising, that aspect of like incomes and prices rising in concert seems to be missing, right? There seems to be like something that's more than just nominal inflation going on with whatever thing it is we're looking at. So one of the reasons housing is a problem is, from my research anyway, is that depending on which stats you look at, which cities and so on, price of housing is increasing faster than incomes. So there's not this idea that like housing is going up because there's more money in the economy and so everything is going up together. no, it's actually eating into more of people's income. College education is eating into more of people's income, and student loan debt is on track to be bigger than credit card debt. So you have these different aspects of the economy where prices are going up, but it's not like inflationary in the sense of we just have more money, here's what's going on. There seems to be like a core market problem going on. But when people call it inflation, like I kind of alluded to at the beginning, there's kind of like this Schrodinger's political football element where it is this general, vague government policy about the Federal Reserve or about something that should be done. On the other hand, it's kind of like this act of nature that just happens. Inflation just happens. There's more people, there's more stuff in the economy, there's more stuff going on. And so you just get inflation. And so when people use the word, it's kind of like they can bounce subtly back and forth between the two modes for the word, which is one of the things I've been really, really annoyed with. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is, actually, I don't remember what the last thing I wanted to bring up is. I'll probably remember it later, but I think this is a good place to get started on talking about broader things, and we'll pick it up later.
All right, Keith, some of your thoughts.
Well, if we want to talk about inflation and what drives that, I think it's one of those things that has multiple causes and different circumstantial factors might drive different situations as well. One thing that we hear a lot about today is the debt economy, about how people, more and more people are in debt than ever before. Like most people have credit card debt, student loan debt, mortgage debt, so all kinds of debt. A big question is why is it like that? Some people will say that, well, it's because the people are being squeezed by financial institutions or landlords or credit card companies or student loan programs or whatever. And other folks will say, well, there's also the question of expectations, consumer expectations. At one point, most people didn't have student loan debt because not nearly as many people went to college. Or as far as credit card debt, there's always the question of, well, what are people buying with credit cards? Are they really buying things that they can't do without? Or is there a certain cultural expectation in terms of how people are supposed to be able to live, to put on this image of living a middle class or upper middle class lifestyle, and that a lot of people really can't afford. So are they accumulating debt in order to do that? That's one thesis I've heard advanced at times, that there's a lot of people who have debt simply because they're living above their means, and they're doing it not out of necessity, but because of social and cultural expectations of what you're supposed to do to be a middle class person or whatever. That's an interesting argument. Of course, there's also medical debt. Medical debt is generally thought to be the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States. So we've got a debt-driven economy. And then as far as prices, a lot of things seem to drive prices. Right now, prices for a lot of things seem to be rising because there's an increase in demand. Largely, I think, because the pandemic thing seems to be passing. So things are opening up. Like over the last few days, I've started noticing that more and more stores no longer have the plexiglass thing over the cashier's space, or they're taking the mask mandatory signs down and stuff like that. So now that we spent the last year and a half or so hiding away from the coronavirus, I think things are starting to open up more. And along with that, it's in the middle of summer now, so people are just buying stuff, and that when there's an increase in demand, there's an increase in prices. In fact, yesterday I was at this takeout pizza place, and the guy that runs that place was telling me that he ordered Bud Light for his business, and he was told by the Bud Light distributor that they have a shortage of Bud Light. And I was like, how can you run out of Bud Light? But so apparently, people are getting very beer happy now, going out and buying up all the Bud Light. So the Bud Light production is not kept up with consumer demand, or maybe there's some glitch in the distribution system. So there's a lot of things that drive prices. Housing, I think, is one of the more interesting ones. That's a serious issue in the United States now, because if we look at some of our larger cities, we see that rents really are becoming unaffordable for most people. In some of the worst places, you have situations where even people who have solid middle class incomes can barely afford housing. I know people who live in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles or in New York City who will say that you have people who have professional level jobs, who have high skilled tech industry type jobs, and still can't afford housing. They still, there are people in the Bay Area, for example, who work in Silicon Valley and live in their car, literally. And they're making $70,000 a year or something like that, because that's how expensive housing is there. I think the average rent in the Bay Area is something like $4,200. So it's like 50 grand a year for rent, basically. Even if you're making, say, 70 grand, that's still very difficult to meet. I know I read an article a couple of years ago about a woman who was some kind of, she had like a high income job or some kind of business executive type thing, not one where she's making millions, but, somebody who would probably have a 6-figure income. But this person worked for a firm that was based in Los Angeles, but she actually lived in Arizona. And what she would actually do is fly back and forth to work, not every day, but like every week or something like that. And the reason why is it was actually cheaper to have a house in Arizona and commute by plane to work than to actually buy and pay for a house in the Los Angeles area. So that's a pretty interesting situation. And then there's this question of why is housing so expensive? I think one issue in California, and Joel Kotkin, the social scientist, has written about this a lot. One issue in California, which is where this is the most serious problem, is that they regulate housing markets so much that it has the effect of constricting the supply of housing, and that drives the pricing up artificially. Another issue is I suspect immigration feeds into that because you have so many migrants from other places, including fairly poor or very poor migrants. And that seems to be driving up the cost of housing when you have more people who need relatively cheap or very cheap housing. I know in the western regions of the United States is where you're starting to get all of these tent cities and all these kinds of things as well. So that seems to be a factor. Education is interesting because tuition for colleges has really exploded in the past decade or so. And I think that's a situation where the market is driving itself, because colleges nowadays are basically run like corporations. And their goal is to make money by having as many students as possible. And they encourage students to max out on student loans in order to pay their tuition. And they've also started to lower standards for admission just so they could get as many people into the university as possible, and collect tuition payments from as many people as possible. I've worked for colleges myself as an instructor, and it would always be interesting how the only thing that the administration cared about was making sure I had all the attendance records updated, because they had to make sure all the students qualified for student loans so the university could get its student loan money on time. And that was it. I mean, they didn't care if I was teaching out of Spider-Man comic books or whatever. It was just make sure that information is there so we can get paid. And George Ritzer, the social scientist, wrote about that a bit back in the back in the early 90s. He started noticing some of these kinds of trends in different institutions. He called it the McDonaldization of America, meaning that more and more institutions generally, whether it's healthcare or education or whatever, are being run like fast food restaurants or something like that. So I think we're starting to see that model applied to more and more economic sectors now, and it's starting to show.
Yeah, when it comes to like the rising cost of goods and services, I mean, like you started off with Logos, people sort of default to the increase in the money supply. And while the increase in the money supply can be a factor in the rise of the cost of something, also the rise in demand can cause the price to go up. So while, say, for example, land and housing tends to be a fixed supply, there's only so much land to go around, the demand can go up due to immigration or population growth, which is why a lot of like historic theories that explain invasions, like the Norse invasions or the Mongol invasions, are rooted in population pressures. And given the level of economic development these people had, they couldn't feed the mouths that they had due to the population boom that they assumed happened. And that surplus then went on a pillaging spree on these neighboring societies. And you mentioned, Keith, the Bud Light shortages. There could be an increase in demand, but the other things we see with that causes the increase of the price of goods and services is the dislocation of the economy. So, due to, for example, the coronavirus shutdowns, things like steel and supplements and electronics, a lot of things that come from China, are of course disrupted very severely, and that's going to then cause the price to go up because the demand is either staying the same or going up, but the supply is going down. And also it has to do with labor. So, the normie conservative take is that a lot of these labor shortages are due to the fact that people don't want to work. And while that's certainly part of it, there's the broader problem of the upside down population pyramid. After the baby boom, there were predictions made by sociologists that if this continued every generation, we'd have a population explosion, the population bomb, as Paul Ehrlich called it. But after the silent generation, after coming home from World War II, the baby boom stopped. Each generation had fewer and fewer children, but also people live longer and longer lives. And so the boomers are still working, and they didn't allow many Xers or millennials to take their spot and get promoted up the ladder. But eventually they're just going to die or retire. And because there's fewer people alive now, since the baby boom than were born in the baby boom, there's going to be all these unfillable spots just by default. And, obviously immigration might be a way to alleviate that. But for example, Mexico, one of the main places immigration is coming from, is also has a very low TFR rate, which is like 1.3. And when 2.1 is the bare minimum you need to maintain, an equilibrium of population. And that was in The Empty Cradle by Philip Longman, which was published 15 years ago. So the idea that we're going to have cheap labor indefinitely in light of the global population crunch is not a viable assumption. And the main reason why we're having labor shortages is this is the first wave of this population constriction. Furthermore, after COVID, a lot of people didn't want to go back to work because they were mad at what happened to them. They got burned by the employers, and they're like, well, F you. That's why they started doing the GameStop short, right? They could make money that way and, get revenge on the people that fired them. Many women stayed home. They'd rather be with their kids or just stay home full stop because they can now. And having worked in the market 9 to 5, they're like, that's not for me. So if women make up half the workforce and the majority and a sizable portion of the women don't go back to work, well, that's going to be a huge, gap in the population. And also, since many boomers and Gen Xers only had one kid, that one kid can just live with mom and dad, and his or her presence won't be a very large financial drain on their parents. So they don't have to go back to work either if their parents are willing to put up with that. So there's a whole lot of reasons why the workforce is constricted and why they're having labor shortages. And in light of the larger global population crunch, the businesses that will be the most successful will be the businesses that are best able to capitalize on the workforce, which means it's going to be those businesses that realize you're going to have to increase the wages and working conditions of the workers. Otherwise, you just won't get them. In a lot of ways, this is like England after the Black Death. After the Black Death, feudalism collapsed because the surviving peasants could basically dictate terms to the feudal lords to get work done, which ultimately led to the abolition of feudalism. And as I see with the upside down population pyramid and with the decline of the boomers, either through retirement or death, then we're going to have something I think somewhat akin to the post-Black Death economic order in England and the rest of Europe. But Logos, back to you. Maybe you remembered your third point.
Yeah. So the broad point, I guess, in my first opening. So you guys were talking about a lot of alternate explanations for rises in prices, which is right. That's good. The main point I wanted to bring up is how people call everything inflation just because prices go up. And as we just talked about, there can be a lot of fundamental market, physical, economic reasons why prices are moving and doing what they do. And so I guess the first question I was bringing up in my opening is like, is this talk of inflation helpful? Should it just go away? What should we do about this? Like the political meta about the topic. The second point I wanted to bring up, I guess, is actually related to your point about the upside down population pyramid. I actually remembered it because we were talking about this a while ago, and you brought this up when you're talking to your environmentalist friend, Derek Jensen, I think his name was.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. The idea that, okay, so is there a grain of truth to the way that people are misusing the term inflation? Like traditionally, what it means is like per unit of currency, your purchasing power goes down because there's more currency, and so prices have adjusted or something like that. But it seems that what people want it to mean these days is something like my purchasing power is going down. Now, what are ways you can measure your purchasing power? You can do it in terms of like your income. What can you buy with your yearly income? Take that as it is. Or you can think of it more physically, like what can I buy per hour of labor time? And if you think about inflation, I guess in a really broad sense, that's not, I don't think technically accurate, but I think the frustration people are trying to get out when they use the term is just that like they can't buy what they used to. When you think of it that way, I think the population explanation is actually really, really interesting because this is one of the things I was kicking around with you, Todd, that you brought up to Derek, is that let's suppose you have like a job. And I use the example, I think, of a doctor when we were talking about this in DMs. Let's suppose you have like a single doctor that can go from house to house to house and like treat a bunch of patients. And like he has a beat, he treats the patients in his beat, and like that's his living. He does all the work, except for maybe ordering some things from pharmacies. He pays for materials or something. He gets the money, and that's how it goes. Well, now you have a hospital. You have front desk staff, janitors, technicians, lawyers, insurance people, bureaucrats. You have so many people up and down the chain that kind of facilitate the same service that, say, a single doctor could provide. And what that means is one of two things is going to happen. Well, let's say one of three things is going to happen. Either A, the number of people that's going to be provided by all these layers up and down the chain is going to explode so much that even though the income is being, cut more ways, the pie's blowing up because you're serving so many more customers that it works out. The other thing that can happen is, well, maybe the number of people you're serving isn't so much more, and therefore one of two things is going to happen in this situation. Either prices are going to go up because you have all these people without a lot of extra aggregate income to pay for all these people facilitating these extra steps of work, or prices are going to not change too much and you're just going to divide the pie into more slices based on who's doing each steps of this labor. And I think to a degree, because of our population pyramid thing that you're talking about, Eric Weinstein talks about this all the time, the idea that our economy was like structured and predicated on the growth through the baby boom. But then after the baby boom, it started going haywire. We tried to fix it in some degree with, I guess, mass immigration, but you're bringing poor people in from their countries that don't come with resources. They have to work. They have to take time to accrue generational wealth and so on. And by the time that happens, who knows how that like affects the chain? You're talking generations down the line. Now, so in the span of this crunch, arguably institutions aren't seeing like way more people and doing way more stuff, depending on the institution to make this work. And so I think that to a degree, prices go up, but also people's income as they're part of the chain along the process also gets structurally cut as well. There's like a mix of those things kind of happening. And so instead of looking at just like government policy in terms of, debt and money and gold standard and, the usual right-wing libertarian stuff, I think we can also look at, like you brought up, the population demographics and the units of labor that each person's being provided in the total chain of people that like make up a service. And that's also a good way you can think of housing as well. Physically, people demand housing. There's so much of it to go around. It could be artificial in some places, as Keith pointed out, due to zoning. There could be other restrictions. But I guess my broader point here is I think if we take the broad idea of inflation as, people's purchasing power going down, I think we could get ahead of it and hopefully have more useful conversations. I don't think the media is going to do it because the media is dumb, but I think that hopefully political commentators could have more useful conversations on this if they look at it in kind of like these physical terms of what units in labor are people producing, how much are those units of labor worth in the whole system in terms of what services are provided, who's all providing them, like who all comes together to provide them, and so on. I think that the conversation might do better if it was structured that way. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Keith, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that leads into a lot of questions about things that are going on now. One trend that we see in the United States today is the widening gap between rich and poor in terms of wealth distribution. The statistical data on that shows that the gap between rich and poor is about at a 100-year high, about the worst it's been since the 1920s. And if we look at the Gini coefficient, which measures the degree of wealth inequality in particular societies, the way that works is the higher the Gini coefficient, the more wealth inequality there is. If we compare all the countries around the world, about 195 countries or whatever it is, the United States is easily in the top 10 or probably top 15 or 20 countries in terms of the overall wealth inequality. So we have a huge amount of wealth inequality in the United States. Now, of course, that has to be considered in the light of other factors. There's also a higher degree of say, aggregate wealth, just in terms of the sheer amount of wealth in the society when we compare the United States with, say, the Central African Republic or something. So aggregate wealth also matters as well as wealth inequality. And then as far as the causes of wealth inequality, there's a lot of different factors. I would guess there's probably dozens of factors that fuel wealth inequality, ranging from monetary policy and industrial policy and technology and probably social factors and immigration probably enters into it on some level. And there's a lot of different things that have been attributed to that the wealth inequality has been attributed to, and there's probably a lot of truth to many different things like that. But the issue of inflation is interesting as well because increasingly now we're starting to hear fears about inflation coming from different sources. And I know that on the libertarian right, as Logos mentioned, there's long been this kind of emphasis on hyperinflation is coming. I've been hearing the Austrian economists, for example, saying for decades now, hyperinflation is on the way, hyperinflation is on the way. And that's starting to creep into more mainstream, I guess, conservatism or whatever you want to call it. And I think in part it's because of the growing popularity of figures like Bernie Sanders, where you'll have people from the other side of the spectrum on the the Fox News type saying, well, you like Bernie Sanders to the presidency, and America will be like Venezuela. I know people who are devout, Fox News watchers and devout Republicans. They bring that up all the time. They say, well, and Bernie Sanders, America will be like Venezuela, which I think is comparing apples and oranges. I don't really think there's a comparison between, an FDR liberal like Sanders and something like Chavismo. I mean, they're totally different types of economies and totally different types of societies, and it's a problem to make that kind of comparison. But I do see this kind of I don't know if you call it fear mongering or worry about inflation coming along more and more. And I think that it is true, though, that in the future there's probably going to be another economic reckoning. We had a major economic downturn last year during the pandemic because of the lockdowns, and then back in 2008 we had the housing market meltdown. And it's interesting how people who are younger now, this is what they've grown up with. They've grown up in the in a world where there's a depression every decade or so. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the future, and if we continue to have difficulties of this type, and I suspect that we will. One thing that we're seeing while we're talking about housing is that now that the moratorium on evictions is being lifted because the pandemic is passing, you have people who have all this back rent due. People who've been unemployed or only working on a limited basis for over a year now have all this back rent due, and there's concern there's going to be an eviction crisis. So we might actually see more homelessness and so forth. Also, it's been the other issue that's been raised lately is the fact that you have these very elite investment firms now that are buying up the housing, like people are being evicted or landlords are going out of business, small landlords, and then you have these big investment firms that are actually buying rental housing, and there of course are people concerned about the Chinese companies buying up rental housing in the United States. So it's definitely drifting in an interesting direction.
Yeah, Keith, when you brought up the widening gap between rich and poor, I think there's a lot of ways you can look at that. Well, let's look at the housing for one. One of the reasons why I think we also have a housing crisis is because, unlike historically, where there were multi-generational households, both in fact and in the actual building, we have housing has become more of something that you expect with individuals, especially with the rise in divorce and the loose connections people form. You don't have a household with mom and dad, the kids, grandma and grandpa, maybe an aunt or an uncle like you would have had before. So you need to have, and these houses are huge too. They're not like these small little, shacks. They're huge, but only like one person lives in them or two people live in them, or maybe at most four, a family of four. And it's a very inefficient way of housing the population. And so as the population fragments and atomizes based on individualism and the fact that houses need to be bigger but only hold 1 to 4 people at most, then you end up with this crisis. It's like, you could easily fit 10, 12 people in some of these houses, but you're not going to. And so that creates this pressure of maladjustment of resources. We're not building the right kind of houses to efficiently house the amount of people we have. And another reason why, as you pointed out, Logos, people's purchasing power is going down is in part because the economy of the United States used to have, beginning in the post-Civil War era, was a manufacturing production economy with steel and coal and oil. And then later, manufacturing in the post-war era was electronics. But now we've shifted over to a service economy, which I would argue, and many have argued, the boomers and the Xers have engaged in the largest malinvestment in history. Instead of spending money on necessities, they spent it on junk, sports, films, comic books, electronic toys that you throw in a year. And so that money is not being spent on a coal plant that's going to generate value and revenue for the next 50 years. You're not spending it on, a steel mill or a shipyard. You're spending it on junk. And that junk doesn't then give you resources back into the economy. It's a net negative. It's gone. You don't see it anymore. And as far as the widening gap, we have on the one hand, people are getting squeezed by the financial institutions, in part because they can, because of government backing. So one of the driving causes behind college tuition going up is the fact that there's government loans behind it, and those loans can't be defaulted on. So it's the safest bet you can have. And so they can keep on raising it to pay for all these, frills to attract, non-academic types to the college to get more money. But again, this isn't one of those malinvestments. People aren't getting educations anymore, not practical ones. They get indoctrinated. So on the one hand, the government is backing these sort of expenditures, which allows financial institutions to raise the cost. The other one is generational wealth is not passed on. The boomers and a few of the Xers are holding the vast majority of wealth that's been generated since 1945. And they're not passing it on to millennials or Zoomers. And those that are actually, dying or retiring, to the extent they have wills at all, many of them are just spiting their kids by giving it to charities. And this also raises the question, the government has been wishing for a death tax for many, many years. Maybe they'll just pull out a death tax and just scoop up all the accumulated wealth and leave the millennials and the Zoomers holding the bag. That's another possibility. But again, the lack of transfer of generational wealth, which, the boomers were able to receive generational wealth from the silent generation. job opportunities are constricted because of the labor supply. I mean, if the labor supply doubles when women become half the workforce and more beginning in 1978, and then you further dilute it with immigrants, well, all of a sudden, labor is cheap. And so each individual laborer's contribution to the economy is minuscule. This is something that I did bring up with Keith, you, and Derek Jensen, the idea that, if you have, say, 500 people and there's 1,000 jobs, then yeah, you're going to have huge bargaining power. But if that balloons to 50,000 people, then your contribution to the job market is negligible. So I think all of these things converging together are contributing to the lack of purchasing power, which I think, Logos, you said, is what most people think of when they think of inflation. So, Logos, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sounds like we're all in agreement on the broad topic that talking about inflation as inflation 99% of the time is just folly. Because, for most of the conversation now, we're just like, yeah, inflation, meh. Let's talk about things that are causing it. Wealth inequality, intergenerational wealth, the population pyramid, immigration. It's all been pretty brass tacks, like physical stuff. So, yeah, I guess I'll just take that as a resolution for the first part of my question that, as far as the political meta is concerned, most current topics on immigration or current conversations about are just bad. But in terms of thinking about it as people's purchasing power, then yeah, a lot of this stuff is relevant. So one of the things I've been thinking about is what predicts what, if you were to pretend to do nothing about the economy and just look at this physically, what would predict whether somebody's going to be say rich or poor? And one of the things I was thinking about is if you're providing a physical service that is being shared with lots of other people providing the physical service, like the doctor, the janitor, the receptionist, and so on, over time, your income is probably not going to be rising relative to the economy as time goes on, because your job is kind of being shared. You're providing a fixed service that's being shared with multiple people aiding you in providing the service. So just looking at it in the abstract, what predicts people get rich? For me, it seems to be managing multiple people, so administrators, because as you add more and more and more layers to a service, if you add somebody like HR or administration or somebody to manage all the people, and you just add more and more people, then that department will kind of scale with the size of the organization instead of having their job being shared with it at multiple levels. And the other one would be if you manage technology. And I don't mean you're an individual help desk clerk. I mean if you were a CEO or head of a company that's Cisco or something that runs routing services or runs, internet providing services. Any service that's being used by a lot of people that can scale and grow as the economy grows, if you're kind of at the figurehead of all that, you're going to kind of do pretty well. The other people are, say, investors. If they have a pool of money, they can kind of feed into the market like tendrils that grows with companies and so on and so forth. And they can just move money around. And that will scale even as more jobs add, as more complexity gets out of the economy. So there's certain things that are scaling, I think, with the way the economy is changing. And there are certain traditional jobs that were kind of good while the population was stable and while the structure of our economy was stable that haven't kept up with how our economy is changing. And so one of the things you pointed out, Todd, was the service economy. So as we lost manufacturing jobs, we ended up gaining administrative jobs, desk worker jobs, cashier jobs, all sorts of jobs that are for intermediate steps. And so as I think about the way the economy has kind of changed and restructured itself around the loss of manufacturing, one of the things that I've thought of as of late is which job types have had to kind of share the weight and cut up their piece of the income pie with these new job influxes since the loss of manufacturing, and which job types have been able to scale with the changes in economy. And that's, I guess, why I was talking about my broad categories earlier. So yeah, I think that's my way of tying together what you and Keith were saying.
Okay, Keith, any thoughts?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting too is that nowadays we're starting to see anti-capitalism make a comeback in terms of political affiliations and things like that. It's interesting to watch how on the right now you have these ideas like national conservatism or integralism. I know there was an article recently in the New Statesman magazine talking about this wave of new intellectuals on the right in the United States that reject the old supply side model, the Reaganite model that was the dominant model on the right for 40 years, or really even longer than that. Instead of in place, they're putting into these ideas like integralism or national conservatism, and these guys like Patrick Deneen and others. And you have this guy Pedro Gonzalez who calls himself a Leninist, like a right-wing Leninist. And then, of course, on the left, you see a lot of this kind of stuff as well. You find all these people that have this renewed interest in Marxism, Leninism, tankyism or whatever. Or people calling themselves democratic socialists or social democrats, and all the stuff that goes into that. And I think clearly what's driving that is the experience people have had with economic life. As I said earlier, you have a generation now that's is somebody that was, say, in their early teens in 2008 and experienced the economic meltdown that happened then, and then they experienced the economic meltdown of last year when they're, say, in their middle 20s. This is what they think of as being the American economy. As opposed to somebody like me. Like, my parents were from the generation that entered adulthood right after World War II. And then that was the time when you had, for one of the first times in history, when you actually had a working class that could live the lifestyle of an upper middle class, this kind of post-war American middle class from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. That's what I grew up in, that kind of post-war American middle class. And out of that came, the Reaganite model of economics. And now that's done a total about face, because you see more and more people that are, they grow up in, say, Midwestern and formerly industrial towns where the local economy's hollowed out, and the only job you can get is like working at an Amazon warehouse under like 19th century working conditions, or they've seen the economic meltdowns I was talking about earlier. So it looks like that public opinion in many ways is doing an about face, particularly among a lot of younger people. There's a public opinion is doing an about face on some of these economic questions. And I think wealth inequality is really the big thing that's driving that. And it's not just that people are objectively saying, well, it's terrible that some people are richer than me, or that some people are richer than other people. I don't think it's a philosophical, moralistic argument as much as it's just personal experience. People are, seeing, living in conditions where economic life is getting harder or more difficult, and they're starting to migrate more towards these kinds of anti-capitalist or more redistributionist economic policies. And as to what degree inflation would be in feeding that, I think that the cost of things on some level is concerning to a lot of people. Housing I think is probably the big thing. Student loan debt is one, credit card debt. All of these kinds of issues I think kind of feed off of each other. Like I mentioned earlier that medical bankruptcy is generally thought of as being I don't know what the actual data on this is, but I've heard frequently said that medical bankruptcy is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States. So that's why you have now so many people who are increasingly in favor of socialized medicine or Medicare for all, or whatever the latest rendition of that is. In the food in the chat, Todd mentioned food. Yeah, food costs are actually going up. That's one thing I've actually seen quite a bit of in the last decade. When I think back on what food costs were, say, as recently as, say, the mid 2000s, food costs are actually going up. Also, when we see food costs rising, we definitely see civil unrest and stuff like that. Some economists will look at what happened with the Arab Spring back in 2011 and say, preceding that, there had been a significant rise in food costs throughout that region of the world. And when people have trouble eating, they start to get upset. So, and that often, I know in a lot of third world countries or underdeveloped countries, or whatever you want to call them, whenever there's an inflation on food prices, people are crazy. You have literal food riots and things like that. Transportation costs too. I know many years ago, probably over well over 20 years ago. I remember seeing an article about, I think this was in Argentina, it may have been in Venezuela, where the government decided to raise the price of public transportation, fares for public buses and trains and things like that. And they had mass rioting over this, I mean, it would be kind of like in our system, let's say the government puts a tax on gas, and so gas prices go up, and everybody's out, smashing up windows and throwing rocks and things like that. So, well, they actually had that actually happened in France, and not long ago they were having the Yellow Vest riots in France, and a lot of that was rooted in the fact that the government was trying to raise, they were trying to put more fuel taxes, more taxes on fuel over the issue of carbon. So the idea was, well, we're going to reduce carbon consumption through putting more taxes on fuel consumption, which is going to be a disincentive to fuel consumption. So you had a lot of people, particularly from the more rural or outlying areas outside French cities. They said, well, this is really going to impact our living standards because we're dependent on fuel for transportation and to commute back and forth and all of that. So that is one of the things that fed into the Yellow Vest riots, which got pretty violent in many ways too. It was on a level of the kind of stuff you often see in poor countries. So yeah, I mean, inflationary or the perceived threat of inflation is always a problem. I know a lot of people who are older who vote faithfully for the Republicans, and they still think back to the 1970s when we had a big problem with inflation in the United States. In fact, I remember at one point the government was issuing these little buttons you could wear. I even had one. It was called WIN. That was a little red button, and it said WIN on it. Whip inflation now. Because inflation was a problem during that time period, and by the end of the 70s, inflation had become a serious problem, and fuel prices were going up. It was another thing. And Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980, promising to restore the economy, and then inflation and all that did go down in the 1980s. And I know to this day, I know older people who think Ronald Reagan saved the economy or whatever, which I don't really agree with, but that is the perception that some people and places have. So I think whenever when people start perceiving a threat to their livelihood, they do tend to adopt a more desperate outlook, I think, and that fuels into a lot of these kinds of things we see going on now, the violence we've seen on the street in the United States, and riots and polarization of people into extremist groups and things like that.
Well, I guess since we're nearing the end, one thing that I'll end with is when we look at, say, millennials, there were three economic crises. One was the 2001 dot-com bubble, one was the 2008 Great Recession, and then one was 2020 with COVID. There was literally no way to have a savings, because with each of those, your income gets wiped out. You probably got fired from your job. And a lot of people, especially with housing crisis, had their money tied up in houses, and then it just got vaporized when housing prices fell. And so one of the reasons why the wealth is leaving these communities is because they've been playing, the lottery, so to speak, of Wall Street. And, just like the house, Wall Street always wins, right? It's all about trying to pump up a bubble so that, you put money in it, but they're basically just having you buy all the toxic assets that they're just going to dump on you so they can, get their money out and won't have to pay the cost. There was a guy in the 1920s, and I think his name was Fredrickson, who wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Regulator. And he told you that this is exactly what happens. When they tell you to buy, you should sell. And when they tell you to sell, you should buy. Because a lot of these financial gurus are trying to offload their bum assets onto you so that you get caught with the bag and they get to walk away with their assets intact. And a lot of people just kept on falling for that, because prior to the post-war era, most people weren't investing their money like that. Most middle class, lower class people weren't putting their money into 401ks and in houses and in all these investments, which then keep on going up in smoke with these bubbles. And so, yeah, you have to start over because you invested your money in something that wasn't a very good investment. So Logos, your last words. You there, Logos?
Sorry, I missed the button. Thought I had muted myself. I was wrong. As far as last words, I don't know. I think we've roughly covered everything. I mean, we've talked about inflation. We talked about the difference between, I guess, nominal inflation and the way inflation's perceived. We talked about social change being driven by people's standard of living lowering. You know, what they do for work, what they do for money, is just going not as far. It's not buying as much as it usually does, and so they're feeling their lives being constricted. That seems to be the biggest issue. I think we all agree that talking about inflation, just skipping the broad appeals to inflation and just talking about what seems to be physically going on with prices, what seems to be the physical cause, what seems to be the physical effects, seems to be a much more constructive way of having the conversation. I guess the only thing I can end with is on a question. Like, the people who are in academia, the people in the media, the people who are putting forth these narratives, I mean, they should know at some level that it should be more productive to talk about why prices are rising, the particulars, the physical facts, and so on, and level with their audiences. So I guess the last question that I'd leave for you two in the audience and everybody else is just why don't they do it? Why do they play this two-step with inflation that I brought up earlier? Why is it this Schrodinger's game of it's this general government policy about, you know, inflation rates in the Fed that somebody should do something about, or it's this active God in the economy that, you know, just happens and we just don't need to, we can kick that can down the road for a few years, or, you know, it's terrible but vague, but we're not going to talk about the real physical causes or what to do with it. Like, why does the media keep playing this game? Is it some sort of cynicism? Is it because they're involved? Is it because maybe they really are just that stupid? I guess that's the final question is why are the discussions about this so bad in most like public circles on CNN and Fox and so on? Why are things this bad?
All right, Keith, last word.
Well, as far as the public discussion of economic questions, I generally find mainstream economics debates to be very, very shallow on a fairly general level anyway. You know, in fact, when it comes to the debate between the so-called free market conservatives on the right end and the neoliberals in the center and the social democrats on the left, I tend to not even enter into that. For a variety of reasons, because I generally reject a lot of the premises that they're all arguing from. You know, it's kind of like, why participate in a debate where you don't even agree on the terms of the debate. And that's, of course, that's true of many things. You know, whenever I see the talking heads on CNN or something like that, I mean, I think their analysis of everything is shallow. I mean, there's nothing that's substantive about any of them. In fact, and increasingly, those programs are just becoming entertainment. I mean, they're becoming like professional wrestling or soap operas or something like that. And in fact, they even admitted that recently. You know, there was a court case that MSNBC was involved in recently where they pretty much admitted that Rachel Maddow is just an entertainer. Like, you know, we don't intend for anybody to take her seriously or anything like that. Just, you know, this is just a show. So, you know, that explains the media issues. But yeah, on a more substantive level, though, one thing about economics is that it is very complicated, and it's also boring to a lot of people. You know, it's like math class or something. But when problems start to develop, people want very simplistic explanations for things. And in fact, I know Ludwig von Mises. I'm not really a Misesian or whatever, but Ludwig von Mises once said that you know, economics is a discipline that requires serious analysis and to understand it. And you know, you can't learn about economics from listening to somebody shout at a political rally or something like that. And I think he definitely had a point there, in the sense that a lot of discourse about economic questions does involve that. It's people looking for simplistic causes about very complex phenomena. You know, wealth inequality is the big one. You know, like I think if I were going to write a paper, say, on wealth inequality and its causes in the United States in 2022, I could probably come up with a list of 50 things that have probably fed into that easily, easily 50 things. But you know, it's just a matter of people looking for very simple solutions to complicated problems, and I think that's why the discourse on this is fairly limited.
All right. Logos, Keith, thanks. It's a pleasure as always. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.